If you have followed Jesus even just a little while, you have probably had days when you were Hezekiah, faithful, trusting in God, diligent in God's service, throwing out every idol in your life one by one, and yet suddenly caught in a scary, overwhelming, faith-testing situation well beyond your control. Because being faithful to God, does not mean that you'll never face trouble in this life. Jesus was more faithful than anyone, yet he faced difficulty and opposition, and in the end, he faced the cross. Hezekiah was faithful too. He was a man of great faith, yet he found himself caught in a terrifying situation. When you find yourself suddenly being Hezekiah, what do you do? How does a person of faith respond in the face of an overwhelming, out-of-control situation? So we're studying the kings of ancient Israel and Judah from the Bible's books of Kings and Chronicles, except that in our reading last week, the nation of Israel in the north was conquered by the massive Assyrian Empire, and all that was left of Israel was the nation of Judah in the south. And so for the rest of this sermon series, we'll be studying just the kings of Judah. Hezekiah is our next king of Judah. Here's how his story begins, 2 Kings 18 and verse 1. In the third year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel, Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. He was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 29 years. His mother's name was Abijah, daughter of Zechariah. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father David had done. He removed the high places, smashed the sacred stones, and cut down the Asherah poles. He broke into pieces the bronze snake Moses had made, for up to that time the Israelites had been burning incense to it. It was called Nehushtan, which sounds like the Hebrew for bronze and snake. Hezekiah trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel. There was no one like him among all the kings of Judah, either before him or after him. He held fast to the Lord and did not stop following him. He kept the commands the Lord had given Moses. And the Lord was with him. He was successful in whatever he undertook. He rebelled against the king of Assyria and did not serve him. From watchtower to fortified city, he defeated the Philistines as far as Gaza and its territory. Hezekiah was a man of great faith. Kings tells us he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father David had done. In the books of Kings, David is the standard of faithfulness to God, and not many kings of Judah and no kings of Israel lived up to that standard. But Hezekiah did. Hezekiah, when he takes the throne, works hard to abolish idolatry from Judah. He even breaks into pieces that bronze snake Moses had made 700 years earlier. It was an icon God had used at that time to work a miracle of healing for Israel. But now the people of Judah had corrupted it into an idol that they worshipped, which gives us a sense for just how prone to idolatry Judah had become by this time. Kings doesn't mention it, but 2 Chronicles 29 through 31, speaking about Hezekiah, tells us that from the start of his reign, Hezekiah reopened the temple of God. His father had closed it down, but Hezekiah reopened it. And he restarted the Passover celebration, which for many years had been neglected. This was a king and a man who was diligent in honoring God. Verse 7 tells us Hezekiah was successful in whatever he undertook because the Lord was with him. He even rebelled against the king of Assyria and did not serve him, which was a complete reversal of his father's policy of submitting to the Assyrians. We read about his father Ahaz 2 weeks ago. We are blessed to have a lot of information about this time in that part of the world from archaeological findings and ancient writings from the ancient Syrian Empire. Some of those writings actually mention Hezekiah, including mention of a group of small nations that teamed up with Judah to rebel against the Assyrian Empire when the Assyrian king died suddenly in 705 BC. We think that was when Hezekiah rebelled against the Assyrians also. Unlike his father, King Hezekiah put his trust in God, not in the power of the Assyrian Empire. Now, the writer of Kings pauses here for a moment in the story to give us a little context. This is verse 9. In King Hezekiah's 4th year, which was the 7th year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel, Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, marched against Samaria and laid siege to it. At the end of 3 years, the Assyrians took it. So Samaria was captured in Hezekiah's 6th year, which was the 9th year of Hoshea, king of Israel. The king of Assyria deported Israel to Assyria and settled them in Hala, in Gozan on the Habor River, and in the towns of the Medes. This happened because they had not obeyed the Lord their God, but had violated his covenant, all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded. They neither listened to the commands nor carried them out. We read about these events last week, the tragic fall of Israel in the north, because, as the writer reminds us here, they had not obeyed the Lord their God, but had violated his covenant. So the writer's giving us context here. Hezekiah watched the fall of northern Israel happen. He saw two things at that time. He saw Israel refuse to obey God, and he saw Assyria crush Israel into nothing. So what would Hezekiah do in Judah? The Assyrians were still out there. How would he deal with Assyria and all its power? How would he, as the king, deal with the true king of Judah, the one true God? With Assyria, Hezekiah had put his trust in God and rebelled against the king of Assyria and did not serve him. That was in 705 BC. The new king who came to the throne at that time in Assyria, his name was Sennacherib. Great name. He was not pleased with that rebellion. Assyrian records tell us that in about 701 BC, Sennacherib brought his armies into the region around Judah and crushed that rebellion. And suddenly Judah and King Hezekiah had no defense against the Assyrians. So let's pick up the story again in verse 13. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah's reign, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, attacked all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. So Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent this message to the king of Assyria at Lachish: I have done wrong. Withdraw from me, and I will pay whatever you demand of me. The king of Assyria exacted from Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. So Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was found in the temple of the Lord and in the treasuries of the royal palace. At this time, Hezekiah, king of Judah, stripped off the gold with which he had covered the doors and doorposts of the temple of the Lord and gave it to the king of Assyria. Hezekiah had rebelled, and so the king of Assyria attacked, and though Hezekiah was faithful to God, things went very badly for Judah. Verse 13 says, King Sennacherib captured all of Judah's fortified cities, and Assyrian records agree with that. In fact, they specify that they captured 46 fortified cities of Judah, plus a number of small villages, and 200,150 captives from Judah. They basically reduced Judah to just a small circle around Jerusalem, maybe at the most 30 miles wide. Hezekiah was in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was in trouble. And so he did what we often do in our weaker moments. We don't know if he prayed about this decision or not, but he tried to dig his own way out of his troubles, and he doesn't seem to have involved God. He paid off the Assyrians with silver and gold in the hope that they would be satisfied and leave. But, as we'll see in a second, it didn't work. The Assyrians happily took all that wealth and just kept coming for Hezekiah and Judah. And isn't it that way whenever we take our best shot at solving our problems on our own without involving God? We say, I can beat this addiction on my own. It's not that bad. And we don't go get help that God has provided for us. And we're even afraid to pray and ask God to help us break the addiction because, we don't want God to find out we have an addiction. Hezekiah might have stumbled in his faith a little bit here. But we do the same thing sometimes. God help us. And so we'll go easy on him. We worry about our friends, our families. He had to worry about his whole nation. The Assyrians kept coming. Assyrian records tell us they attacked the city of Lachish in Judah. It was a major defensive post about 30 miles southwest of Jerusalem. It was one of the last big defensive posts before enemy armies could reach Jerusalem. So this is verse 17. The king of Assyria sent his supreme commander, his chief officer, and his field commander with a large army from Lachish to King Hezekiah at Jerusalem. They came up to Jerusalem and stopped at the aqueduct of the upper pool on the road to the washerman's field. They called for the king, and Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, the palace administrator, Shebna, the secretary, and Joah, son of Asaph, the recorder, went out to them. The field commander said to them, "Tell Hezekiah, this is what the great king, the king of Assyria, says. On what are you basing this confidence of yours? You say you have the counsel and the might for war, but you speak only empty words. On whom are you depending that you rebel against me? Look, I know you are depending on Egypt, that splintered reed of a staff, which pierces the hand of anyone who leans on it. Such is Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to all who depend on him. But if you say to me, we are depending on the Lord our God, isn't he the one whose high places and altars Hezekiah removed, saying to Judah and Jerusalem, you must worship before this altar in Jerusalem? Come now, make a bargain with my master, the king of Assyria. I will give you 2,000 horses if you can put riders on them. How can you repulse one officer of the least of my master's officials, even though you are depending on Egypt for chariots and horsemen? Furthermore, have I come to attack and destroy this place without word from the Lord? The Lord himself told me to march against this country and destroy it." Then Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, and Shebna and Joah said to the field commander, "Please speak to your servants in Aramaic, since we understand it. Don't speak to us in Hebrew in the hearing of the people on the wall." But the commander replied, "Was it only to your master and you that my master sent me to say these things, and not to the people sitting on the wall, who, like you, will have to eat their own excrement and drink their own urine?" Sometimes I wish the writers of Scripture weren't quite so careful to tell us exactly what was said. The Assyrian field commander, sent by the king, did everything he could to terrify and intimidate the people of Judah. With a large part of the Assyrian army behind him, he mocked Judah. He said their ally Egypt would fail them. He offered to loan them 2,000 horses if that would help the military of Judah. At the end of verse 27, he's warning that when the Assyrians surround and besiege Jerusalem, all the people caught inside will starve. And the commander talks about Judah's God. He says, God won't help Judah because Hezekiah has been tearing down God's high places, which is true, but actually that was exactly what God wanted Hezekiah to do. He'd wanted those high places gone for a long time. And he says, the Lord himself told the Assyrians to come destroy Judah. Just to add pressure, the commander speaks again, this time making sure all the people on the wall can hear him. Verse 28. Then the commander stood and called out in Hebrew, "Hear the word of the great king, the king of Assyria. This is what the king says. Do not let Hezekiah deceive you. He cannot deliver you from my hand. Do not let Hezekiah persuade you to trust in the Lord when he says, the Lord will surely deliver us. This city will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Do not listen to Hezekiah. This is what the king of Assyria says. Make peace with me and come out to me. Then each of you will eat fruit from your own vine and fig tree and drink water from your own cistern until I come and take you to a land like your own, a land of grain and new wine, a land of bread and vineyards, a land of olive trees and honey. Choose life and not death. Do not listen to Hezekiah, for he is misleading you when he says, the Lord will deliver us. Has the God of any nation ever delivered his land from the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim, Hena, and Ivah? Have they rescued Samaria from my hand? Who of all the gods of these countries has been able to save his land from me? How then can the Lord deliver Jerusalem from my hand? But the people remained silent and said nothing in reply, because the king had commanded, do not answer him. Then Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, the palace administrator, Shebna, the secretary, and Joah, son of Asaph, the recorder, went to Hezekiah with their clothes torn and told him what the field commander had said. Can you imagine how Hezekiah must have felt when he heard this message? The pressure just mounting upon him and his people. Have you ever had a day when you were Hezekiah here? When the whole world is crashing down around you and there's not much you can do to stop it? Most of us have had days like that. Even the most faithful people, even Jesus himself, have times like that. My parents and my brother and his son were here with us these past 2 weeks. Not last week, but the 2 weeks before that. When I was 10 and my brother was just 6 months old, my parents found out that he had cancer in his kidneys, and it was bad. At about the same time, I think it was the same month, my parents both lost their jobs, just very suddenly. And so all of a sudden, they were raising 3 young kids, one of whom had cancer. They had just taken out a mortgage and bought a house, and they had no income. It was a terribly difficult time for them. Some of you have been through much worse times than that. When you find yourself being Hezekiah, faithful, but having a really bad day, what do you do? Hezekiah had already tried to take care of the problem himself, had tried paying off the Assyrians, but that didn't work. In times like this, it's hard to have faith. It's hard to see how God is going to get us through the mess, how he's going to deliver us. Partly because we can't see God, but we can sure see the mess. Partly because even though we believe in God's power, we just don't see how he can get us through. In times like this, it's hard to have faith. And the Assyrian commander, his message to Judah here is basically, your God cannot deliver you. The people of Judah were already wondering if God could deliver them. Can he protect us from this great army that's just outside our city walls? No other God had stopped the Assyrians from destroying whatever land or city they had attacked. Why should the people in Jerusalem think their God would be any different? And we face troubles sometimes that are so intense and so overwhelming that we can't see how God could deliver us. We have faith. We believe in his power. We just can't see how he could do it. Yet Hezekiah trusted in God. He was a man of faith. He had faltered maybe a little bit at first, but now his faith engaged full force. And here's what he did. Chapter 19, verse 1. When King Hezekiah heard this, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and went into the temple of the Lord. He sent Eliakim, the palace administrator, Shebna, the secretary, and the leading priests, all wearing sackcloth, to the prophet Isaiah, son of Amoz. They told him, this is what Hezekiah says. This day is a day of distress and rebuke and disgrace, as when children come to the moment of birth and there is no strength to deliver them. It may be that the Lord your God will hear all the words of the field commander, whom his master, the king of Assyria, has sent to ridicule the living God, and that he will rebuke him for the words the Lord your God has heard. Therefore pray for the remnant that still survives." In this moment of terror and despair, what did Hezekiah do? He turned to God. In overwhelming grief, he went to seek God in his temple. And he sent a message to the prophet Isaiah, pleading with him to pray. Please, please pray. I remember that day when I was 10 years old, and my parents were in the doctor's office with my baby brother. And I remember when they came out of the doctor's office, my sister and I were waiting in the car. Mom was crying, and Dad looked grim. The doctor told us, Dad said the doctor told us that my brother had cancer. That was a big surprise. None of us knew what would happen next. But I remember my dad right there in the car at that moment prayed. I don't remember us ever praying in the car, ever. But at that moment, we prayed. I don't remember a word he said. I just remember he prayed. And for the next 2 years, we kept on praying until my brother was well and the cancer was gone, and praise God, it's never come back. And Mom and Dad, they both got new and better jobs, and the life of our family was stable again. My parents, in their moment of grief and fear, prayed. They went straight to God. And that's what people of faith do. Hezekiah, grieving, went straight to God. And God responded. Verse 5. Chapter 19, verse 5. When King Hezekiah's officials came to Isaiah, Isaiah said to them, "Tell your master, this is what the Lord says. Do not be afraid of what you have heard. Those words with which the underlings of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me. Listen, when he hears a certain report, I will make him want to return to his own country, and there I will have him cut down with the sword." Do not be afraid, the prophet Isaiah said. God was about to deal with this pompous king of Assyria. See, the king of Assyria had made a mistake. Through his commander, the king had challenged the might and the honor of our God. And so God was ready to do battle. He said the king would hear a certain report that would make him want to return home. We think that might have been a report of Babylon trying to rebel against Assyria at this time. That's mentioned in Assyrian records. And in his own country, the king would be cut down with the sword. We'll come back to that prophecy in a minute. Verse 8. When the field commander heard that the king of Assyria had left Lachish, he withdrew and found the king fighting against Libnah. So the king of Assyria left Lachish because he had just destroyed Lachish. Online, you can find pictures of something called the Lachish reliefs. You see them on the pictures on the screen behind me. These are wall carvings that Sennacherib had crafted for his palace sometime after what we're reading about, to celebrate his conquest of the city of Lachish in Judah. Apparently, he was very proud of that victory. And so now, having defeated Lachish, he moves on to Libnah. He's working his way toward Jerusalem, and he's getting close. Hezekiah had prayed, and God had answered, prophesied deliverance for Jerusalem, but the trouble wasn't done yet. The Assyrians were still out there. So verse 9. Now Sennacherib received a report that Tirhakah, the king of Cush, was marching out to fight against him. So he again sent messengers to Hezekiah with this word. Say to Hezekiah, king of Judah, do not let the God you depend on deceive you when he says, Jerusalem will not be given into the hands of the king of Assyria. Surely you have heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all the countries, destroying them completely. And will you be delivered? Did the gods of the nations that were destroyed by my predecessors deliver them? The gods of Gozan, Haran, Rezeph, and the people of Eden who were in Telassar? Where is the king of Hamath or the king of Arpad? Where are the kings of Lair, Sepharvaim, Hena, and Ivah? So the Assyrians were advancing toward Jerusalem, And then the king of Assyria heard that an army was coming up from the south. That was going to delay his attack on Jerusalem. So he sent another message in the meantime to intimidate Hezekiah, hoping Jerusalem would just surrender. That would make his life a lot easier. And again, he made the mistake of challenging the power and the honor of Judah's God. And once again, Hezekiah, in desperate faith, turned to the Lord. Verse 14. Hezekiah received the letter from the messengers and read it. Then he went up to the temple of the Lord and spread it out before the Lord. And Hezekiah prayed to the Lord, Lord, the God of Israel, enthroned between the cherubim, you alone are God over all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and earth. Give ear, Lord, and hear. Open your eyes, Lord, and see. Listen to the words Sennacherib has sent to ridicule the living God. It is true, Lord, that the Assyrian kings have laid waste these nations and their lands. They have thrown their gods into the fire and destroyed them, for they were not gods, but only wood and stone, fashioned by human hands. Now, Lord our God, deliver us from his hand, so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone, Lord, are God. And notice how Hezekiah deals with this situation. He is not cocky in his faith, like, oh, do your best, Sennacherib, but my God's going to crush you. And he's not comfortable, like, hey, I'm just going to give this situation over to God and it's all going to be fine. No, he's like us on a Hezekiah kind of day. He's passionate in his prayer. He's desperate. He's probably terrified. Earlier, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and went into the temple of the Lord and sent word pleading with the prophet Isaiah to pray. Just because you're faithful doesn't mean you'll always be confident and unafraid. Life is scary sometimes. This time, Hezekiah goes into God's temple again, spreads out Sennacherib's letter before the Lord, and begs God for help. There's nothing easy about faith. If it were easy, it wouldn't be faith, right? Faith is hard. But faith is not complicated. All Hezekiah needed to do was to go to God and pray. And Hezekiah couldn't see it, but God was already ready to act. And when God decides it's time to act, he can act very quickly. Things speed up here at the end of the story. Verse 20. Then Isaiah, son of Amoz, sent a message to Hezekiah. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I have heard your prayer concerning Sennacherib, king of Assyria. This is the word that the Lord has spoken against him. Virgin daughter Zion despises you and mocks you. Daughter Jerusalem tosses her head as you flee. Who is it you have ridiculed and blasphemed? Against whom have you raised your voice and lifted your eyes in pride? Against the Holy One of Israel. By your messengers you have ridiculed the Lord. And you have said, with my many chariots I have ascended the heights of the mountains, the utmost heights of Lebanon. I have cut down its tallest cedars, the choicest of its junipers. I have reached its remotest parts, the finest of its forests. I have dug wells in foreign lands and drunk the water there. With the soles of my feet I have dried up all the streams of Egypt. What God is saying here so far is that the king of Assyria thinks he's really big, that he can go wherever he wants, he can do whatever he wants, he can cut down forests and dry up rivers, but he went too far when he blasphemed and ridiculed the Holy One of Israel. So verse 25, Isaiah continues, have you not heard? Long ago I ordained it. In days of old I planned it. Now I have brought it to pass that you have turned fortified cities into piles of stone. Their people, drained of power, are dismayed and put to shame. They are like plants in the field, like tender green shoots, like grass sprouting on the roof, scorched before it grows up. But I know where you are and when you come and go and how you rage against me. Because you rage against me and because your insolence has reached my ears, I will put my hook in your nose and my bit in your mouth, and I will make you return by the way you came. Here God is saying, King Sennacherib, the only reason you're so powerful is because I made you powerful. I planned this long ago that you would be able to destroy nations and change political boundaries. But now you've gone too far. And so I'm sending you back home. And we have pictures from ancient Assyria of Assyrian kings leading away their captives with hooks in their noses or sometimes in their upper lip. And so what they did to others, God is now going to do metaphorically to the king of Assyria. He's going to hook him and drag him away back to Assyria. Verse 29, the prophecy continues. This will be the sign for you, Hezekiah. This year you will eat what grows by itself, and the second year what springs up from that. But in the third year, sow and reap, plant vineyards and eat their fruit. Once more, a remnant of the kingdom of Judah will take root below and bear fruit above. For out of Jerusalem will come a remnant, and out of Mount Zion a band of survivors. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. Here God says to King Hezekiah that he will know God did this when in the current year there won't be any sowing or reaping. They'll just have to eat what they can find out in the fields that grew by itself because the Assyrian army is still in the land. It's not safe to farm. And next year there still won't be any agriculture. But the year after that, all the farms will be back in action, and Judah and Jerusalem will survive. And Hezekiah will know that God did this because he foretold it. Verse 32. Therefore, this is what the Lord says concerning the king of Assyria. He will not enter this city or shoot an arrow here. He will not come before it with shield or build a siege ramp against it. By the way that he came, he will return. He will not enter this city, declares the Lord. I will defend this city and save it for my sake and for the sake of David, my servant. And so God foretells through Isaiah that Jerusalem will not even come under attack. After all the threats from the king of Assyria, after all the intimidation, God himself will rise up and defend Jerusalem, and he will send the king of Assyria back the way he came. That's the prophecy that Isaiah spoke. Now here's what God did. Verse 35. That night, the angel of the Lord went out and put to death 185,000 in the Assyrian camp. When the people got up the next morning, there were all the dead bodies. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, broke camp and withdrew. He returned to Nineveh and stayed there. That night, after Hezekiah had prayed, there was no way Hezekiah could have seen this coming. He could not have foretold how God would bring about Jerusalem's deliverance. God sent his angel, and the angel put to death 185,000 Assyrian troops. Sennacherib's army was devastated, and all he could do was pack up and go back home before some other army that was still intact came and attacked him. The Greek historian Herodotus, about 250 years after these events, mentions that the Assyrian army suffered a huge, bizarre loss one night. He gives credit to an Egyptian god, but the Bible gives credit to the angel sent by our God. So Sennacherib hurried back home. And then 20 years later, verse 37, one day, while he was worshiping in the temple of his god Nisroch, his sons Adramelech and Sharezer killed him with the sword, and they escaped to the land of Ararat. And Esarhaddon, his son, succeeded him as king. That was 20 years later, according to ancient records. That assassination fulfilled the prophecy spoken by Isaiah back in chapter 19, verse 7, that the king of Assyria would return to his own country and there be cut down with the sword. As it turns out, his own sons killed him. We never know how God is going to help us through times of trouble. Hezekiah certainly didn't know what God would do. All we know is that he will. And that's why we pray. Faith isn't easy, but it also isn't complicated. Like Hezekiah, a man of great faith, we pray. And God helps us. Judah survived. And the God of Israel proved his power over the Assyrian army. He was the one God they could not overcome. Things are going to happen in our lives that are overwhelming. We won't know why God let them happen. But God will still be there. And he will be faithful. And even if the worst happens, God will still be faithful. The worst happened to Jesus. He was killed on a cross. But God raised him from the dead. Our God is faithful. That's why we trust him, like Hezekiah did. And that's why we pray. Let's pray now. May God bless you. Dear God, as we are here together in this place to worship you and to study from your word and learn from you, Lord, we don't know the struggles that each other are going through today. We don't know what difficulties might be in each other's lives. Sometimes we know a little bit. A lot of times we don't. But Lord, you know the hearts of each one of us. You know what's going on in our lives from day to day. And Lord, I just pray that you would give us faith like Hezekiah's. Not that what happens in our lives wouldn't hurt when it's bad. Not that we would always be confident and strong and never cocky, oh Lord, never arrogant. But Lord, help us to trust in you. You have always been faithful to your people, and we know you will always continue to be faithful. Help us, oh God, and give us strength and wisdom and faith to pray. And Lord, hear our prayers when we pray to you in our desperate times. Thank you for your great love for your people. Thank you for sharing this story with us, Lord, so that we might know the great things you have done in the past and have confidence that you will help your people again. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.